So this is United American Cemetery, and this is Mr. Chris Hanlin.
We are in Madisonville on Duck Creek Road. We're at the United American Cemetery. This cemetery was founded in 1883, and it was originally called the United Colored Cemetery. It was founded by a group called the United Colored American Association at a time when white cemeteries typically would not accept African Americans. For a long time in Cincinnati, white people didn't want to have African Americans buried in their cemeteries, so African Americans had to fend for themselves and create their own places of burial. And this is one of those places. Like I said, this was created in 1883. It was a farm prior to that time. But I just want to point out, this is the stone of Henry Ferguson. He ran Cincinnati's Cotton Club. He owned it. His wife, Lulu, managed it. He also was an important business leader, ran a large taxi cab company, was one of the local leaders of the NAACP. If you look down on the ground here, there's a tombstone for Harriet Clay, who was born in 1846 and died in 1947, a few months shy of her 101st birthday, and was a friend of Booker T. Washington. So there's a lot of history here. We're going to walk this direction. If you were to walk back this way just a little bit, there's a tombstone for a man named George James Austin, who was a World War I veteran. He also ran the military program at Tuskegee Institute, and he was the father of Elsie Austin, who was the first Black woman to receive a law degree from the University of Cincinnati. Now, she died in Texas in 2008. Not sure where she's buried, probably not here. I'm standing now at the tombstone of this man, Frank Hall, first Black person elected to Cincinnati City Council in 1931, served a 2-year term. He's in the uniform of a Cincinnati police detective because that's how he got his start. He was also the board chair of a segregated hospital called an African-American hospital called Mercy Hospital, no relation to the current Mercy Healthcare. And down here is the tombstone of his daughter, Cleopatra Hall, later Cleopatra Perry. That's her. She attended the University of Cincinnati, where she was one of the founders of a sorority that I've been told was the first African-American fraternal organization at the University of Cincinnati. In fact, there's at least one other person who was a founder of that organization is here. One of the most important stories in this cemetery is the story of military veterans who are buried here. Even prior to the Civil War, Cincinnati did have a militia made up entirely of African Americans called the Addicts Blues, after Crispus Attucks, a Revolutionary War soldier who was a person of color, first casualty of the Revolutionary War. When the Civil War broke out, the Addicts Blues offered their services to the Union Army and were told they weren't wanted. But a few years later, President Lincoln warmed to the idea of having African-American soldiers. The leader of the Addicts Blues was a man named Julius Hawkins. He's buried here someplace. We don't know his location. He actually, once African-Americans were allowed to join the Union Army, he did join the Union Army. He'd been a captain in the Addicts Blues, went back to being a private so he could join the Army. There are at least 55 soldiers who fought in the Civil War who are buried in this cemetery. One of them is a man named Henry Ellis. He fought with the 54th Massachusetts. That's the unit that is portrayed in the film Glory, that did some of its recruiting here in Cincinnati. Henry Ellis joined from here. He was promoted from private to corporal by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw himself, the man portrayed in the film by Matthew Broderick. Henry Ellis survived the assault on Fort Wagner, which is the climactic battle of the film, returned to Cincinnati, and is buried on this hillside. We know his location, but we don't know. He doesn't have a marker. So perhaps we'll get a marker for him someday. Another of the important military stories here Actually, I'm going to interrupt myself and just say, if you look across this landscape, it's not quite as crowded with tombstones as you would expect to see in a place like Spring Grove. Is that because there's not very many people buried here? No, it's because carved stone monuments were expensive, and this was an economically disadvantaged community. There's probably 3 or 4 times as many people buried in this cemetery as there are visible markers. If you could afford a burial plot at Spring Grove, you could also afford a tombstone. But a lot of times, somebody here would just get a little wood cross or something like that that's long gone. So how do we know there's so many people here? We know that from death certificates. But a death certificate doesn't tell you exactly where somebody is, only which cemetery they're in. So there's thousands of people buried here who we don't know exactly where they are. We just know they're here somewhere. Returning to the Civil War, one of the important stories of the Civil War that maybe you already know is the story of the Black Brigade. In 1862, there was great fear that the Confederate Army in Kentucky might manage to head north, cross the Ohio River, and invade Cincinnati. As a result, as a consequence, white Army officers and white policemen rounded up African American men in Cincinnati at bayonet point and forced them to begin building fortifications to protect against Confederate attack. And because the white people who did this were not clear on the principle of opposing involuntary servitude, the African Americans protested, they were released, and they came back in much greater numbers as volunteers. And a number of the people who were in the Black Brigade are in this cemetery. There's a stone here from William Jordan, who died in 1879. 4 years before there was a cemetery here. How to get here? Let's go up here and we'll look at a couple of these stones and look at a little bit of the iconography of some of the stones that are here. This is Milton Franklin. Its name's very worn, but you can trace it out with your finger. Now, there is a Milton Franklin on the muster roll of the Black Brigade. It's almost certainly the same guy. So let's look, what else can we tell about Milton Franklin from the tombstone? Well, there's a Masonic symbol here. There's the compass and square, so he's a Mason. This is a laurel wreath, symbol of victory. And this is something interesting. If you look at a nice tombstone like this, usually a shaft like this would come to a point like the little obelisk there, or it would have a little cap on it like that one, or it would have a little finial on top like that one. And yet this one just is carved to have a rough surface there around the laurel wreath. That's because this is the emblem of the broken shaft, symbol of life cut short. And in fact, we know that this man, there's a death notice for him in the paper, says he died in 1862 at the age of 50. So that jives with life cut short. But again, this tombstone is much older than the cemetery that we're standing in, and doesn't belong here. So here's the story. See, until the 1840s, there was no cemetery at all, no nice cemetery that would accept African Americans. If you were African American, you went to the city-owned Potter's Field and were buried with the poor people in an area with a lot of unmarked graves. Didn't matter who you were. So in the mid-1840s, a group of people got together, and they called themselves the United Colored American Association, and they raised $1,000, which was a lot of money for an African-American community group at the time, and they purchased 3 acres of ground in what would become the village of Avondale, and they founded the first African-American cemetery in this area. But as the village of Avondale grew up around the cemetery, and it became a wealthy white enclave, the wealthy white citizens of Avondale became increasingly unhappy with having an African-American cemetery in their midst. And in 1880, a group of property owners from Avondale went to the Ohio State House in Columbus, and they lobbied for a bill that would give the Avondale Board of Health the power to declare that cemetery a public nuisance and have it closed. There was a protest meeting at Allen Temple, which was a Methodist church downtown. Peter H. Clark was one of the people who spoke at that meeting. And Peter H. Clark said this. He said, "The aristocracy of Avondale wish to drive us away from here. Where shall we go? Will they open Spring Grove to us?" And the crowd laughed. Peter H. Clark continued, "The aristocracy of Avondale should not forget that this cemetery existed long before their village. We bought it. It is ours by right of purchase. We went out there in the country to get away from the white man who seemed to hate us dead or alive." But despite Peter H. Clark's powerful words, the bill passed the Ohio State House, and the Avondale Cemetery was ordered to be closed. The UCAA made arrangements to sell the property in Avondale. They purchased 11.5 acres in Madisonville, and they began making arrangements to transfer tombstones, coffins, bodies, and bones from Avondale to Madisonville. And that's why there are tombstones in Madisonville that are older than the cemetery they're in. In fact, the terms of sale of the Avondale property stipulated that the UCAA would receive 60% of the money up front and the other 40% after they'd moved all the bones.
Like, how do you move thousands of bodies without losing bodies?
It was a gradual process that took over a year. The bill passed in 1880. They dedicated this cemetery 3 years later in 1883, and they continued moving bodies all the way into 1884. So they would disinter the coffins, bring them to the surface. If the coffin was still in reasonably good shape, that made it easier. If the coffin wasn't in good shape, it made it harder. There's a lot we don't know about exactly how that process worked, but it was clearly a chaotic process. Everybody was mad at everybody. The lot holders in Avondale were mad at the UCAA. Avondale was, people in the UCAA were mad at Avondale. It was a contentious and horrible process.
Thank you.
Here we go. This is Isaac Nelson Ross, bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He had an amazing ability. He worked in congregations all across the nation. He had an amazing ability to figure out how to retire a congregation's debts and get them on a sound financial footing. And that's why he ended up being a bishop in the denomination. His spouse is Mary Fletcher Ross, and she was instrumental in the creation of the Cincinnati Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, which was a powerhouse organization. They purchased a very large house in Walnut Hills for their headquarters, a house that had been designed by Samuel Hannaford, Cincinnati's greatest architect, and that had been home of a former Cincinnati mayor. They paid that house off. They paid off the mortgage in the 1940s, which was an unbelievable achievement for an African-American women's group at the time. The organization still exists. They do have archives. I know that some students from Xavier have contacted them and have looked some at their archives, but I suspect that there's a great deal more to be done regarding the Cincinnati Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. And their children are also buried here. In fact, some of the names are inscribed on this side of the tombstone if you want to come around. The top name that you see here is William Oliver Henderson Ross, who died in the 1925, and his obituary says that he was one of the most important African-American physicians in Cincinnati. And the next name down here, Martha Hall Ross, that's her. She was a social worker. She was also the second Black woman to graduate from the University of Cincinnati. And so the Ross family was a powerhouse family, and there's probably more research that needs to be done about the Ross family. This is a veterans marker. That's what they looked like in World War I. We also have some Civil War era veterans markers that were quite similar, but a little bit different. And as you walk around cemeteries, you'll get the knack of recognizing these. This is James Winkfield. He was one of the Harlem Hellfighters. Hellfighters was a name given to them by the Germans. It was an all African-American unit. I don't personally know a lot about military history. I was here with a military history buff a couple of months ago, and when he found out that we had one of the Harlem Hellfighters here, he was very excited. He says that's a very big deal, but I honestly don't know very much about it. The stone that has fallen over is the tombstone of Irvine Garland Penn. He was a journalist. He had his own newspaper outside of Cincinnati. Then he wrote a book called The Afro-American Press and Its Editors about other journalists. The book included a chapter on female African-American journalists. He co-wrote a pamphlet about the Columbian Exposition with Ida B. Wells and some others. And an amazing person. Became an officer in the Methodist Freedmen's Aid Society. He raised money for African-American colleges in the South. One of his primary benefactors was James Gamble, who was the son of the founder of Procter & Gamble. This is John M. Owens. He was born into slavery, came to Cincinnati, and went to work for the Cincinnati Reds as an office manager, and he was an office manager for the Cincinnati Reds for 30-some-odd years. James A.S. Clark was one of the wealthiest African-American men in Cincinnati. He got his start in steamboating. In fact, Carter Woodson, who writes about how steamboating was one of the professions that were open to African-Americans, that you could actually make money on. He was one of the most respected African-American men in Cincinnati. Also buried here is his son, Chestine, son or stepson, I'm not sure. Sometimes the apple really does fall far from the tree. Chestine Clark was a notorious tough who carried a knife, and lots of people were afraid of him. The great journalist Lafcadio Hearn knew Chestine Clark slightly and said that he was an altogether unpleasant fellow. For the truly friendless and indigent, the Potter's Field continued to be an option. But the African-American community worked very hard to keep its people out of there. And there's a good article in a Cincinnati newspaper in 1887 that said, when an African-American person dies, people go out and they solicit contributions to try to give this person a handsome funeral. And if money's very tight, they might have to get a coffin from the city undertaker, but even then they'll purchase a brass ornament for it. And it talked about some of the fact people who were, just roustabouts or lower class people, and who were buried here. But there were African Americans who did continue to be buried in the city Potter's Field. That Potter's Field moved from the music hall location to a spot that is where the parking lot for the museum center is now, and then it moved out to Price Hill in 1852. And the Price Hill, Potter's Field in particular, is an amazing and spooky place that still exists, now entirely overgrown. And the whole study of the Potter's Field, the relationship between cemeteries and disease and who did and didn't get buried there is a topic that still needs more study. This is not the most important person buried in the cemetery, but I just can't pass it by because it's such a beautiful tombstone. You see the drapery, the veil before life and death, the eternal flame. Oak leaves, symbol of strength, but also several other plants that I don't actually know what they are or what they represent, named Walter Cousins. There's a younger man, a generation younger, named Walter Reuben Cousins, who's buried here. Possibly this man's son, likely. Reuben W. Cousins was one of the members of the Black Brigade. He was also, at age 8, he went to work for the Cincinnati Gas Light Works Company, worked for them for 29 years until he died. And his obituary says that he knew more about the valves and mains of the gas works than any engineer the company ever had in its employ.
Is there anyone who wasn't allowed to be buried here?
There's murderers here. There's sex workers here. This is a microcosm, and I'm not aware of anyone who was not allowed to be buried here. This is Jenny Jackson. She was a famous singer. She was one of the original Fisk University singers. They helped popularize, they were an a cappella group, helped popularize the spiritual as a musical form. She went on tours to them to England and Europe. She was mobbed by crowds. She came to Cincinnati. She founded her own singing group, the Jenny Jackson Concert Company. And then she married this man, Andrew Johnson DeHart, an important educator, principal of what was at the time the only school for African American children in Cincinnati, and regarded as one of the best African American orators in the state of Ohio. This is Priscilla Jane Thompson. She was a poet, wrote several books of poetry, including one called Ethiop Lays. She was the daughter of two escaped slaves. She grew up in Ross Moines. She self-published so that no one could take credit or profit from her work. Her brother Aaron was also quite a well-known poet. He lived in Indiana. His poetry is more comic. Hers is more serious. He was actually the better known of the two. One of his books of poetry got an introduction by James Whitcomb Riley.
Are people still being buried here?
That's a great question. There are burials here as recent as 2019. The sexton here said he felt like the place was getting pretty full, and I'm not sure what the church will do. There certainly are things that they could do, including creating places for small niches. There are outdoor places for small niches that have been created in other cemeteries, including other African American cemeteries like Beech Grove. So this may continue to be an active cemetery, but it's not clear yet. And that's the tomb of William H. Parham. He graduated from Cincinnati Law School in 1874. That is now the UC College of Law.
Okay.
So he's the earliest black graduate of any program currently associated with the University of Cincinnati. In the late 19th century, at the time this cemetery was dedicated, medical schools did not have the same rules as today about how they acquired corpses for dissection. And there were people who would come out here in the middle of the night and dig up freshly buried bodies and sell them to medical schools. Cincinnati Medical College downtown paid between $15 and $25 a piece for fresh bodies. They didn't ask a lot of questions about where those bodies had come from. The problem of body snatching afflicted every cemetery, but it was worse in cemeteries where people were poor or politically powerless or both, and that included African American cemeteries. Body snatching was a problem at Union Baptist. It was a problem here. It was a problem in Avondale. And it was especially a problem when they began the process of moving coffins, disinterring and moving coffins from Avondale to here, because some of the coffins came up light. And only when they found the coffin coming to the surface light did they know that that person's body had been stolen years earlier and nobody had known about it. A man named Jackson Moore had been a beloved figure in the African American community, a Masonic leader, educator. His coffin came up empty. A woman named Owens, I'll think of her first name in a moment, Susan Owens. Her coffin came to the surface and it was empty except for her clothing.
What do you mean when you say came to the surface?
Oh, sure. They went to Avondale to move the graves to here, and they would dig up the coffin, and they would bring the coffin up to the surface, and then they would load it onto the wagon and bring it here and rebury it.
So before it had ever been removed, even before the cemetery had been moved, they'd been stealing bodies.
Correct. The bodies had been stolen from the Avondale Cemetery, but nobody knew how bad that problem was until they tried to move the bodies.
Okay, now I'm
sorry,
seeing questions. No, that's great. I'm seeing questions about people going to court. Did anybody ever sue? Did anybody ever get caught? Did anybody recover remains of their loved ones?
Sure. So there were continual calls for investigations, but doctors defended the practice, and they defended the body snatchers. See, in the post-Civil War period, enrollment at medical schools had skyrocketed. And most states, most jurisdictions had laws that said if an impoverished person died at a state institution like a city hospital, that burial could be used for dissection by medical students so that they'd have a body to practice on. But Ohio didn't have a law like that, or they did, but it was so hedged around with restrictions that it didn't function. And what the doctors said was, you want doctors to be well trained. You want us to be able to set a bone. You want us to be able to cut a nerve. We have to practice on somebody. The law makes it a penitentiary offense for us to do that. So we're going to go about this the best way we know how. So the people who ran the medical schools were white. The people who did the body snatching were sometimes white and sometimes black. Bodies being snatched were sometimes white, sometimes black. The problem was worse in black cemeteries. And the doctors defended this practice. Body snatching was a horrendous and immoral response to a genuine dilemma. But then there's a newspaper article that says considerable apprehension has been felt by the African American community because the key to the vault at the United American Cemetery has been stolen, and other mysterious maneuvers have been practiced thereabouts. And the body of Dangerfield Early is stored in the vault, and there's concern that people are trying to steal it. So his relatives have stood out here on the grounds, heavily armed, for several nights. So when you come out here, you have to imagine that it's December and it's the middle of the night, and you are surrounded by men with guns trying to protect the body of their reverend father from being stolen for unauthorized medical research.
Were they successful in protecting their...
We believe that Dangerfield Early was eventually buried here, but we don't know. He doesn't have a tombstone. He does have a lot marker at the top of the hill, and we don't know for sure. In 1881, there was a new anatomy law that did make it easier for medical schools to legally get the corpses of some impoverished people for dissection. And after that, the problem began to subside. What you're seeing out here, 1883, 1884, that's the tail end of the old system, just as awareness and enforcement were starting to take place. But at this time, the whole idea of donating your body to science didn't really exist yet. And you have other creepy stuff. We've got a voodoo doctor buried here. We've got some of the people who were guilty of body snatching buried here. So if you want more creepiness, we got more creepiness.